Major funding for the rebroadcast of this series has been provided by the Charles H. Revson Foundation, the estate of Mortimer J. Harrison, and the Jacob Burns Foundation. Additional funding has been provided by the Lemberg Foundation. Major funding for this series was originally provided by the Charles H. Revson Foundation, Petrie Stores Corporation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the following: a complete donor list is available from PBS.
For me, there is a sense of wonder in this place. One can almost hear within it, reflected by its vaulted ceilings, the sound of Jewish prayer. For this was once the great synagogue of Toledo, and its memory of a flourishing Jewish life in Spain persists. That time is gone, but its bittersweet legacy lives on. By the 9th century, North Africa and Spain were in the hands of Muslim rulers. The Jews had followed the conquest of Islam across North Africa and into Spain. To the north, Christian Europe was beginning to awaken and was on the verge of profound changes. The cultures of three great faiths would meet on the continent of Europe. The Jews would join in the transformation of that continent and would themselves be transformed.
We who are of the remnant of Israelites are dwelling peacefully in this land of Spain, which is called in our sacred tongue, Sepharad. The land is rich, abounding in rivers, springs, and aqueducts. A land of corn, oil, and wine, and all manner of delicacies. It has pleasure gardens and orchards, and fruitful trees of every kind.
Grace, serenity, delicacy, artistry. Those are the words evoked by this patio of the Alhambra, the great Moorish palace of Granada, built in the 13th century. In these precincts, as in all of Andalusia, the southern part of Spain, for more than 2 centuries, Arabs and Jews lived together, side by side, bound to each other despite other differences by a common love of beauty and knowledge, poetry and music, art and philosophy. In Jewish history, despite intermittent waves of persecution and violence, that Spanish era is known as a golden age.
The great wave of Muslim conquest that swept across North Africa had broken upon the shores of Europe, leaving Spain in the hands of Moorish rulers. Jews had followed in the wake of the Muslim conquests, joining in the development of new lands and sharing in the first great florescence of culture since the days of the Roman Empire. Arab civilization built upon a foundation laid by other cultures before it, among them that of the Jews. And in reaching outward to Greece and India and Rome, the Arab Renaissance synthesized a luminous vision of the world. In delicate patterns, the words of the Quran, the holy book of Islam, were carved upon the walls of Muslim palaces. Everywhere in a profusion of detail, beauty and faith were intertwined. In their search for order and beauty, the Arabs left a profound legacy for all time. The Arabs delved into the sciences and into mathematics. It was they who developed a system called in Arabic al-Jabr, algebra. They read the works of classical Greece and were enthralled, exploring in their own minds the paths and byways of philosophy. And in their age of greatest creativity, they tolerated and respected the ideas and beliefs of other peoples. By the 9th century, the vast majority of all Jews lived in Arab lands. They could hardly escape the influence of this new and energetic culture. In many of the lands of Islam, an ideal would emerge among the Jews of living and sharing in the larger society. Nowhere was this ideal more fully realized than in the Muslim lands of Spain. Here in the great mosque of Cordoba, early in the 10th century, Abdul Rahman III established the independent caliphate of Muslim Spain and invited to his realm Arab poets and scientists, scholars and philosophers. Here the Jewish linguist and statesman Hasdai ibn Shaprut served in the court of Abdul Rahman and founded a Jewish court of his own. In so doing, he created a center of Jewish culture unique in the world of his time. A new world of Judaism would be born in this land, the world of the Sephardim, the Spanish Jews. Over the years, they would play a conspicuous part in the government, in the statecraft, and in the scholarship of Moorish Spain. Here in Granada, as elsewhere in Spain, the Sephardim rose to positions of great power. Here, Samuel ibn Nagrela, a Jew, could become prime minister and commander-in-chief of the Moorish armies. His son, Joseph, would succeed him and plan, it is said, the construction of the great red palace, the Alhambra. It was a land of abundance, rich in opportunity, rich in possibilities. From the fruitfulness of Spain, the Moorish and the Jewish cultures drew sustenance, growing side by side and learning from one another. Despite moments of conflict, Jews across this land were free to work as farmers and physicians, artisans and statesmen, astronomers and diplomats. The Jews took inspiration from Arab literature and revitalized their ancient language, Hebrew. For centuries, it had been a language of worship only. In Spain, Hebrew was reborn in poetry and in song. The golden age of Muslim Spain would come to an end as the land broke into separate and warring kingdoms. But even in its final days, its remarkable vitality would find new expression. 3 centuries of the Golden Age resonate in the work of a single man, the greatest Jewish scholar of his time, Moses ben Maimon, better known to history as Maimonides. But to his people who revered him, he was and is known by other names. Rambam, the great eagle, to signify his soaring intellect, and most simply, the second Moses. Forced to flee from the turmoil of Spain, eventually he found refuge in Egypt. In tolerant, bustling Cairo, Maimonides, who would be remembered as a scholar, philosopher, and moralist, became first a mathematician, an astronomer, a physician. As one of the greatest physicians of his century, he was appointed to attend the Sultan Saladin. In the year 1199, he wrote to a friend and fellow scholar of his daily routine.
I dwell at Fostat. The Sultan's residence is in Cairo. Early each morning, I am obliged to visit him. When the Sultan does not feel well, or when one of his children or wives is ill, I cannot leave Cairo. If they are well, I return to my home in the afternoon, but never earlier. All the rooms are crowded with people. I treat them and dispense prescriptions. The coming and going of patients lasts until evening. When night falls, I cannot speak for exhaustion.
Within this routine, Maimonides managed somehow to write continuously 10 books on medicine alone. But it is not for his scientific works that he is best remembered. It is as the sage, the commentator, the wise man. In the synagogue of Ben Ezra, his synagogue, the mind and spirit of the second Moses are alive today. Maimonides searched out the heart of Jewish tradition and codified it in the Mishneh Torah. His contribution has defied the centuries and entered into the thought and life of all of Western civilization.
I wish to help the one worthy man out of his perplexity, to show him a way out of his confusion, so that he may attain perfection and peace.
In the greatest of Maimonides' works, The Guide for the Perplexed, he set out to examine Jewish religious beliefs in the light of philosophy, to reconcile faith and reason.
Let us say that whenever anything in the world seems absurd, ridiculous, or evil, it is because we have but a partial knowledge, and we want things arranged according to our taste and reason. But when we look at life and the world from the aspect of the eternal scheme of things, we will find that what seems to us bad and shocking does so only because of our lack of knowledge and wisdom.
The Guide for the Perplexed was one of the few books written by a Jew since biblical times to become part of world literature. In the closing days of the Golden Age, it was a beacon light that would illuminate the work of scholars of other faiths for centuries to come. But the age which had produced Maimonides was soon to vanish. Moorish Spain fell apart in the 11th and 12th centuries, and Christian armies from the north of the Iberian Peninsula launched a campaign of reconquest, in Spanish, the Reconquista. Over the next 400 years, they would drive inexorably southward and westward into Muslim Spain, until the Moors were forced to yield every piece of territory they had ever possessed. An era was ending for the Sephardic Jews. Muslim Spain was dying, and in its place there would now be a Christian land, joined to the Christian lands of Northern Europe. Europe, in the areas that are now Germany and France, was for centuries a region of vast forests, a wilderness with villages huddled for protection near the walls of wooden fortresses. While the Renaissance of Arab culture reached its heights, Northern Europe remained little more than a fragile outpost of civilization. It was a primitive land, with a population barely clinging to the remnants of a culture brought to them by Rome centuries before. There were no nations, no national boundaries. The only bond between the people was their Christian faith. The first Jews to penetrate to this land were traders bringing goods from the Mediterranean. But in time, as stability and peace were ensured by feudal lords, Europe would become a home for the Jews. By the 11th century, this wilderness began to undergo a transformation. Everywhere new lands were cleared as peasants lived and farmed under the protection of feudal lords. Villages grew into towns, and where once stockades and wooden huts had served, stone walls now rose. In the streets and alleys of these new towns, amidst the bustle of carts and wagons, of pack mules and human porters, it was Jews who were the merchants, they who offered goods for sale from the great manufacturing and trading centers of the Mediterranean and the East. The Jews were the connective link between this frontier society and the sophisticated world of the Muslim lands. Eager to develop commerce in their domains, feudal lords in northern Europe sought to attract Jews to their towns with offers of special charters and privileges. It was the charters granted by feudal rulers that permitted the Jews to settle in the land. The terms might vary, but without exception, Jews were allowed to practice their faith and live according to their own laws as written in the Talmud.
From the 10th and 11th century on, there were established Jewish communities in most of the major cities of Germany and France. The Jews excelled in commerce, and their relations with their neighbors were relatively tranquil. The great Talmudical academies in Germany and France were able to develop an intense intellectual activity. The most conspicuous figure is Rashi, the great commentator on the Bible and Talmud, who lived in Troyes in northern France.
Rashi and other scholars of Europe devoted themselves to the study of Jewish laws, answering letters from rabbis who needed help in judging difficult cases among their people. And difficulties did arise in this new environment, forcing the scholars to modify the laws of the Talmud to accommodate life within a Christian world. Because they were isolated from the large Jewish communities of the East, the Jews of Northern Europe developed an identity that was uniquely theirs. In time, they came to view themselves as a distinct branch of Judaism. They called themselves Ashkenazim, after a land in the distant north mentioned by the Bible. In many ways, the Jews were but one people among the peoples of Europe. In one way, however, they were unique. In matters of religion, Jews were the only strangers. In a world where every event of nature was a mystery, a man's religion provided the only path of understanding. And where men disagreed about religion, they disagreed about the world. For centuries, there had been a competition between the faiths. In the statuary of medieval churches, Judaism was often portrayed as a beautiful woman wearing a blindfold because she refused to see that Jesus had been the Messiah. Across from her, Christianity was shown triumphant, the noble possessor of the truth. The church accused the Jews of having lost the way. And worse than that, it accused them of having caused the death of the Messiah. These accusations, repeated in sermons throughout Europe, were meant primarily to keep Christians from listening to Jewish ideas. but in the minds of the poor and the uneducated, they planted the seeds of hatred.
When I, Rudiger, Bishop of Speyer, changed the town of Speyer into a city, I thought I would increase the importance of the place 1,000-fold by bringing in Jews. Accordingly, I located them outside of the community and habitation of the other citizens, and I surrounded them with a wall so that they might not be disturbed by the insolence of the populace.
The insolence of the populace. These words of a German charter, written in the year 1084, are the first evidence that the common people of Europe were turning against the Jews. Envy of Jewish prosperity was one motive, but religion was the critical ingredient. It would be the fervor of religion that in only a few years would launch a war. In November of 1095, at Clermont in the south of France, Pope Urban II delivered a speech to a gathering of churchmen and nobles.
A horrible tale has gone forth that an accursed Moslem race has invaded the lands of the East. You, who are endowed with the badge of knighthood and are arrogant with great pride, advance boldly as soldiers of Christ. Be mindful of your souls. Rush to free the Holy Land from its oppressors.
In every corner of Europe, Christian nobles prepared for what would come to be called the First Crusade. Before the nobles could organize their armies, however, masses of paupers began to assemble. For these, the poor of Europe, the crusade seemed a great adventure, a chance to escape the misery of their lives. Most of them hardly knew where the Holy Land was, nor indeed who exactly their enemies might be. Their ignorance at this moment of zealous enthusiasm could lead only to disaster. The paupers, now engaged in a war that Pope Urban had never intended. At the end of April 1096, in the Rhine Valley, groups of rabble crusaders assembled into armies. On the morning of a Jewish Sabbath in the beginning of May, they attacked the great Jewish community of Speyer. The Jews fled to the bishop, who used his own troops to fight off the crusaders. The rabble armies now turned against the Jews of other towns. Jews were threatened with death unless they would abandon their Judaism and convert to Christianity. Whole communities were surrounded and attacked. Jews were murdered in the streets. A few agreed to be baptized, but most refused. They chose instead to demonstrate that their own belief in God meant more to them than life itself. Entire communities, hundreds of Jews, committed mass suicide. It was called Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of the Lord's name.
For the time being, the enemy will slay us, and yet we shall live. Happy will everyone be who dies for the sanctification.
Major funding for the rebroadcast of this series has been provided by the Charles H. Revson Foundation, the estate of Mortimer J. Harrison, and the Jacob Burns Foundation. Additional funding has been provided by the Lemberg Foundation. Major funding for this series was originally provided by the Charles H. Revson Foundation, Petrie Stores Corporation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the following:
For me, there is a sense of wonder in this place. One can almost hear within it, reflected by its vaulted ceilings, the sound of Jewish prayer, and was on the verge of profound changes. The cultures of three great faiths would meet on the continent of Europe. The Jews would join in the transformation of that continent and would themselves be transformed.
We who are of the remnant of Israelites are dwelling peacefully in this land of Spain, which is called in our sacred tongue, Sepharad. The land is rich.
A complete donor list is available from PBS.
For this was once the great synagogue of Toledo, and its memory of a flourishing Jewish life in Spain persists. That time is gone, but its bittersweet legacy lives on. By the 9th century, North Africa and Spain were in the hands of Muslim rulers. The Jews had followed the conquest of Islam across North Africa and into Spain. To the north, Christian Europe was beginning to awaken